On behalf of the foundation of Laguna Woods Village, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's television broadcast. It's part of a new series or initiative that the foundation is undertaking called Planning for the Inevitable. The whole series, this will be a number of TV broadcasts, will look at different topics related to that overall topic. The first of our television broadcasts looked at advanced or medical directives. Today's will look at issues related to estate planning. I'm sure that most of you in the audience know the foundation. It is the local village charity that steps in and offers temporary financial assistance when residents encounter financial hardship. Its motto is neighbors helping neighbors. And over the years, that concept of help has broadened. Currently, we are working with Memorial Care Saddleback Hospital to offer full prevention classes in the village. And we also rent emergency response devices for residents who are at risk of falling. Today, we will look at decisions related to planning for the inevitable. What do we mean by that? These are decisions that we should be making now, but for whatever reasons, we put them off. I am Marcy Scheinwald, the president of the foundation. And when I moved here several years ago from New York, I encountered one of those issues. And I didn't know how important it was to deal with it quickly. My husband and I at that time had a will. It was a valid will in New York, and we thought, okay, we're fine in California, not realizing that that wasn't the whole answer to estate planning in California. Over time, I learned that there were special estate planning considerations in California. For example, I learned about the potential impact of probate, and I learned the importance of avoiding probate. I also learned about the need to set up a trust. Today, we are going to be looking at issues related to estate planning with the help of a local elder law attorney, Faye Blix. Faye Blix has been an elder law attorney since 1984. And in fact, she founded the elder law section of the Orange County Bar Association. Faye, I'm really pleased to welcome you today. Maybe the way we should start, because I'm not sure everybody understands what an estate is or what estate planning is. Maybe you can clarify those two concepts.
Sure. I think when I first began, I thought estates were like English country villas. And I think that's kind of a common misconception. But essentially, estate is anything you own. Real estate, cash, personal possessions, those kinds of things. And estate planning is really planning for while you are alive, as well as planning for what happens after you die. So it's essentially giving you the opportunity to say who you want involved, who you want to be your substitute decision maker in the event you can no longer manage on your own or after death, giving to who you want, how you want, when you want, and saving as much money as possible with tax, attorney fees, and court costs.
Okay. What can go wrong if someone doesn't have an estate plan?
Well, unfortunately, a lot can go wrong. And let me just give you an example of somebody that I have had the privilege of encountering with their family and kind of the trauma that happens. This individual was 87 years old when she had a massive stroke. And her son and daughter came in to be able to help her because she was also living with her disabled Down syndrome child. She had done no planning. They couldn't pay her bills because they didn't have access to her bank accounts. And because the stroke was so massive, the doctors were talking to them about withdrawing life support. And then they each had an idea of how that should happen. They didn't know what to do with their brother, the disabled child. And then after her death, because she had close to $1 million in property, both real estate, she hadn't named beneficiaries on her IRA, we had to go through the probate process. And so it ended up costing close to $40,000 in addition to all the emotional trauma of having to now find placement for the brother, having to get a conservatorship over him because that had not been done ahead of time, and then having to pay out of pocket from their own funds to be able to fund the funeral and also the ongoing expenses until the probate court gave them permission to act. So it's not just a matter of expense, it's a matter of expense of the heart too, the emotion involved.
It also takes longer, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, it does. If I do a probate, and it's taking even longer now that COVID has sort of backed up the courts, but if I meet every deadline in the probate process, it's really difficult for me to finish that within a year.
So the people who are waiting for access to the funds cannot have it until that process is completed.
The executor of the estate can eventually be named what's called the executor gets letters of administration, so that gives them official authority to be able to access the funds, but they are only accessible to pay bills. They're not accessible to distribute to the beneficiaries. And so it can be a very convoluted process. And in the meantime, if there's a mortgage due and owing, all of those kinds of things, we have to work with the creditors to hold off until permission is granted.
All right, so to avoid that, what sounds almost chaotic a little bit, what can somebody do? How does somebody begin the estate planning process?
Sure. Well, the first thing is to understand the thresholds. So in California, if you were to die and you had more than $184,500 gross in just your name alone when you died, so in other words, you hadn't named a beneficiary on the account, it wasn't held jointly with anyone. If you have more than that amount, then probate is required whether or not you have a will.
Okay.
Now, the will is helpful in that it does say your wishes, who you want to be the executor, where you want it to go. So at least a will makes sure that the state of California doesn't write the will for you. But it really is important to kind of take a look at your total assets and see what's happening. I think one of the best things to think about is if you could no longer make decisions for yourself, or you are obviously not around after your death, who would you want to be the one who would follow through for you? You want to be the one in charge of choosing that person. And then think through, if God forbid something happened to that individual, do you have a backup? Because I don't know about you, but estate planning to me is about peace of mind. I want to be sure the people that I know and love are going to be in charge of following my directions.
Do you consult an attorney to make that a reality?
I think it's probably the best course of action. Obviously, that sounds self-serving coming from an attorney. But it's just like anything else, we all have our specialties. And estate planning attorneys can really help guide that decision-making. But if you are a little bit adverse of initially contacting an attorney, at least think through those things. If you were incapacitated or you die, who do you want to be in charge? How do you want your estate to be distributed? Do you want them to get it all at once? Will the people that you choose know what your wishes are? Have they been communicated? All of those kinds of things.
I have heard that in California, and that was the advice that I initially got, that it was important to set up a trust.
Right. The reason why trusts are more popular in California is because of our draconian probate process. In other states, probate is much more simple and not quite as expensive on the average. But in California, the fees are set by the gross estate, and they're a sliding scale. So it's like 4% of the first 100,000, 3% of the next 200,000. Anyway, the reason why people prefer to avoid that is because of the time and the expense. And how a living trust avoids that is that we transfer your assets out of your name into the name of the trust, so that when you die, when they check to see if property is in your name, it's no longer in your name as an individual, but it's in the name of your trust. And so as a result, the person that you name as your successor trustee can step into your shoes and begin to administer the estate without asking the court, "Mother, may I?"
Okay, is that what we call a living trust?
Right. A living trust simply means it's a trust that I created during my lifetime. Sometimes it's called a revocable trust. Sometimes it's called an inter vivos trust. But it is a living trust in that while I am alive, I can change it. I can amend it. It has a life. And it allows me to say now who I want. And there are kind of three main players to the trust. There's the trustor, that's the person who creates the trust. The trustee, that's the person who manages the trust. And the beneficiary, the people who benefit from the trust. So as long as you're alive and functional, you wear all three hats. You almost forget you even have a trust.
Okay, so when people use the term revocable trust, what they really mean is that you are in control and you can change it.
Right. As long as you have capacity, you can change it. If it's irrevocable, which it becomes irrevocable after you die, but if it's irrevocable before, if you set it up, it means that you give up all control, usually, of changing it. So for my average family or individual, a revocable trust makes the most sense.
All right. When we met originally, you told me that there was a key misconception about estate planning. What were you referring to, Faye?
Well, I think in general, most people think estate planning is only for the rich. We think about the Vanderbilts and, the Rockefellers. But really, it's for all of us. And, I don't care whether or not you have a $30,000 mobile home or a $3 million property. It's your property. And you should be able to have the right to say, this is what I want. And if you don't do estate planning, it's going to be kind of based on whatever the state writes for you, the laws of intestacy. And so as a result, I think people kind of think, well, it's not for me. Or sometimes they think a will is enough. And
well, that's what happened to me because I moved from New York, and in New York, a will was enough.
Right.
And so I guess it's important for people who move from other states to California to understand what can happen if you have just a will.
Right. I think it's very much worth checking. I don't want to get across the idea that trusts are for everyone, because sometimes if your state is modest enough, maybe it can be handled through payable on death beneficiaries and that kind of thing. But in general, if you own a home, you can just about guarantee that if all you have is a will, that will go through probate. Now, if you hold the house in joint tenancy, the probate won't occur until that second death.
Right, because the other person automatically inherits if they are joint tenants.
But if you have a blended family, for instance, and you each have children from previous marriages, but you own the home in joint tenancy, the last spouse to die wins, basically, you know, because...
Okay, they get
right,
full ownership.
Right, and so with a blended family situation, it's particularly important to think that through, because most of us want to make sure, we want to make sure the spouse is provided for, but you want your kids to feel good about, you don't want to leave them hating the remaining spouse.
I know you talked about blended family when we originally talked about this subject. What if the beneficiaries are underage? How is that handled?
Okay, so in California, anyone under the age of 18 is considered a minor. And so you really don't want them to inherit property, because then there has to be a guardianship set up for them. So you probably want to set up your trust in such a way so that in the event, God forbid, you were to die prior to the age of majority, that the trustee of your trust and the guardian of the persons of those individuals can make plans without having to involve the courts and really set it up in such a way that it really goes smoothly. The other thing we discover, maybe not with your family, but with many of my family members and also many of my clients, you know, the frontal lobe doesn't necessarily develop totally until about age 28 for males. So if your child, even if they're 21 and they suddenly come into $1 million, it's probably unlikely they're going to spend that all on college. They're probably going to maybe get a Ferrari or something like that. And you have to kind of remember that most of us are worth more dead than we are alive if we have life insurance or, you know, those kinds of things. So I think if you think of an estate plan as almost your substitute, you know, if you were still alive, how would you be helping your children out? Would you want them to have it all at once? Or would you maybe help them with a down payment for a house, but not give them the whole wad? It's going to be different for different families, but it's really, that's the key to estate planning. It allows you to shape that and not have it just happen.
Okay, we also, because the foundation has been the beneficiary, some people make charity donations through their estate. How does that happen?
Yes, and I think it's a wonderful thing. An estate plan allows you to name your beneficiaries. And I have many people who are very, convicted tithe payers. So they might say they want 10% of their estate to go to their local congregation. I have other people who have really benefited, say, from the foundation, maybe because they didn't have a lot of cash flow while they were still alive, but when they died, they wanted their manor, their co-op to go to the estate. And you know, if you think about a community like this is where I love to dream, but if everybody in this community even gave 1% charity to the foundation, you know, what a tremendous difference that would make. And it also says, it not only says what the people can do, but estate planning is also legacy. You know, what are you teaching your kids?
Absolutely.
And something about charitable giving really makes a difference. So I'm not saying people should feel guilty if they don't give to a charity.
No, I agree.
But,
and we have definitely been the recipient of a great deal of donation, charity, and good thinking. What I was thinking is, because I see it online, I see ads where people say, avoid the cost of an attorney. You can acquire forms to do your own estate planning. What thoughts do you have about that? Is that a safe option?
Well, sometimes it can be, and that's the thing, sometimes. Often the forms are probably okay. It's just that they are cookie-cutter forms. You know, they are set for the average person, and each of us is unique. And so sometimes lay people don't always understand the ramifications of a certain word. And I don't mean to be condescending. I don't want to do my own plumbing. I mean, you know, in other words,
I don't do my own plumbing.
we all have our different skills. So I guess I don't want to be a snob because I understand the cost of estate planning. So I'm not necessarily saying that the forms are wrong, but if you do them, at least try to have somebody who is in a legal profession review it. And when it comes right down to it, it's sort of a penny wise, pound foolish type of situation. Because I can tell you a lot of the probates that are due is because somebody did the forms wrong.
That's interesting. Now, I moved here almost 12 years ago, and I developed an estate plan sometime after, but I think it's been in place now 11 years. Is there something I should be doing now?
Well, I think the first thing is to just really think through what's happened to you in that 11 or 12-year period of time. Have there been any changes? I always tell people to think of the Ds. You know, has there been a diagnosis that changed your life, either your life or the people you love? Has there been a divorce with any of the people? Has anyone developed dementia? And then, of course, have any of the people died? And it's fairly rare that if you were to look at what your plan was 11 years ago, that some things haven't changed. You know, I hate to say it, but we have some kids that sometimes develop a cocaine habit.
Yes.
Or there's a terrible divorce, or there was a bankruptcy, or there's a tax situation, or maybe there was an accident, so there was a disability. So I always tell people, keep copies of your form, your estate planning documents, with your taxes, so that every year when you go to prepare your taxes, take a look at your documents. Are these still the people that you want to be your healthcare agents? Are these still the people you want to be your executors? How do you feel about that charity now? And the guardian of your children, probably that's not going to apply to very many in your audience, but you know, occasionally your most trusted child moved away and you want someone more geographically close. Laws also change, but they probably have not changed quite as dramatically. But there has been one major tax law that has changed, and that is that our estate tax exemption is far greater than it used to be. And so some of the trusts that we set up for couples for estate planning are not necessarily necessary anymore, because the estate tax exemption now is $12.92 million, which sometimes changes your tax planning.
Faye, we didn't get a chance to talk about the continuum of care as part of the estate planning. And so I may invite you for a second session, because I think that's just as important as planning for the distribution of our assets or our estate after we're no longer here. Is there something that I should have asked you about in terms of estate planning that I didn't ask you?
I think you've really been very comprehensive. I think focusing on the continuum, as an elder law attorney, I have to confess, I'm much more concerned about what happens while you're still alive than what happens after death. And so I think it's important to for people to really think through. You know, when you're dead, you're dead. But
yes.
If you become incapacitated, I think choosing who you want involved is almost more important than what happens after death. So those are the kinds of things to really focus on, and they're not fun to think about. But just think through, if I could no longer make decisions for myself, who would I trust to make them for me? And have I taken the steps to make that formal? Because if I just think about it, and it's nothing documented, it's not going to do any good.
Well, I may call upon you, and we may do a separate session on just that.
Sure.
What is the most important thing that you want people in the audience to remember from what we've talked about so far today?
I think the most important thing is an old proverb, dig a well before you're thirsty. In other words, it's important to do the plan now while you are functional. And don't be afraid of it. You can always change it. But don't be afraid of making the decisions now, getting something in place. Because I see so many tragic situations of people who waited too long. Either they died or they became too incapacitated to make the decisions for themselves. So don't be scared of it. You will live longer when you can put these worries on the shelf.
In other words, what you're suggesting is planning is peace of mind.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to thank you very, very much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's invaluable, and as I indicated, I definitely will call upon you again, because I think the issues of possible incapacitation are very real, certainly here in Laguna Woods. But thank you, and if people have questions about anything that Faye Blix presented today, please contact the foundation. We will be glad to get you those answers. Thank you again for watching.
Thank you.